Elias Rourke sat motionless in the control chair, his eyes fixed on the flickering view screen in front of him. The debris of what had once been Earth's last line of defense, the orbital station, Taurus 7, drifted like a graveyard in space. The lights were dim, the air stale, and the silence oppressive. His ship, an old salvage vessel, barely hummed in the vastness of the void. Yet, for all its desolation, the station was his sanctuary. The last broadcast from Earth still crackled from the ancient radio, a message meant to be heard by the brave few who had held out after the Empire's victory. Elias hadn't listened to it in years. Still, the faint voices from his past kept him tethered to the idea that humanity could rise again. He ran a hand through his graying hair, the weight of the years pressing down on him. The Xerithian cosmic dynasty had crushed the planet like a boot on an insect. Their fleets had come, overwhelming and inexorable, their psionic soldiers dismantling Earth's defenses with ease. The last battles had been fought in space and on the surface, bloody, brutal, and futile. He had watched the cities burn, heard the cries of the dying, but he had survived, alone, hiding in the darkness. Until now. The transmission he had intercepted came through a patched-together receiver. It was coded in an old Terran cipher, one he had used in the final days of the war against the Dynasty. It had been buried under layers of noise and static, but there was no mistaking the voice that now filled the small cabin. The Terran flame lives. It was a phrase Elias knew all too well. It was a myth, a legend among the last of the rebels. One spoken in hushed tones as a final rallying cry, a desperate hope. Some said it was a human who would rise up, the last spark of rebellion in the universe, and lead humanity out of the Empire's grip. Others called it a fool's dream. He had believed in it once, back when Earth still had a chance. He reached for the receiver, his fingers trembling. Who sent this? His voice rasped, unused after years of isolation. The voice didn't respond. Instead, a series of coordinates blinked on the screen. Orcs 9, a mining moon on the fringes of Xerithian space. Elias leaned forward, his mind racing. Orcs 9 was nothing more than a backwater moon, a place where the Empire worked its slaves to the bone, extracting resources from the barren rock. Why would anyone risk contact from there? And why send this message to him, of all people? The possibilities churned in his mind, none of them good. The Xerithians were notorious for their surveillance, their ability to track even the faintest anomaly in space. He had to assume that anyone who sent this signal had already been compromised. But something inside him stirred, a long-forgotten fire. He grabbed the control panel and began plotting a course. The coordinates weren't far. An easy jump through the hyperlane. Orcs 9 wasn't a war zone, but it was a place where the last threads of rebellion might still linger. Elias didn't know if he was chasing ghosts or a sliver of hope, but for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of a plan forming in his mind. Humanity had been crushed, yes, but if there was a chance, however small, that the Terran flame was real, he would find it. And if anyone dared to challenge the human will, they would soon learn just what the last of Earth's warriors were capable of. The jump to Orcs 9 was uneventful, the stars streaking by in a blur of light as Elias manually guided his vessel through the quiet void. The old ship creaked and groaned under the strain of travel, a constant reminder of how long it had been since humanity had truly fought for survival. He ran a hand through his unkempt beard, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The coordinates had been clear, but everything else was clouded in uncertainty. He didn't know if the rebellion that still simmered on this forsaken moon would offer him allies, or if the Xerithians had already snuffed out what little hope remained. Either way, he had no choice but to go. The message had spoken of the Terran flame, the symbol of a rebellion that had never quite gone out. That legend, that myth, was something Elias had once believed in fiercely, before the fall, before Earth had become nothing more than a shadow of its former self. As the ship descended through the dense clouds of Orcs 9, Elias couldn't help but remember Earth. Its blue oceans, sprawling cities, and the endless potential of humankind. It seemed so far away now, as though it had existed in another lifetime. The Zerithians had stripped the planet of its grandeur and forced humanity into a life of servitude. The idea of rebellion, of fighting back, felt like an echo, almost forgotten. But not entirely. Not for him. The landing was rough. The old engine sputtered and coughed as he guided the vessel into a crumbling docking bay. Orcs was a dead world, its atmosphere thick with pollution, and the smell of industrial decay. The mining operations here were all controlled by the Zerithians, who treated the local population as little more than expendable tools. Elias stepped out into the toxic air, his breath shallow beneath the harsh mask. His boots crunched against the gravel-covered ground as he moved toward the designated meeting point, an abandoned warehouse at the edge of the mining complex. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but his instincts told him this wasn't some desperate last-ditch effort. Someone here had access to resources, to information. Someone here was still trying to fight. Inside the warehouse, the shadows stretched long across the dimly lit space, the flickering of failing lights casting erratic patterns. And there, standing at the far end, was a figure. Kale, a Thraxian. An alien race known for their muscular builds and reptilian features. He was young, no older than 20 by Elias's guess, but the sharpness in his amber eyes told a different story. There was something about him, an intensity that was rare, even in the most hardened of fighters. "You're Elias Rourke," Kale said, his voice low and steady, though there was a flicker of reverence beneath the words. "I've heard the stories." Elias nodded, though the mention of his name made him uncomfortable. He wasn't some hero, not anymore. He was just a man who had watched his world burn, and was now trying to piece together the remnants of something long gone. "Then you've heard the legend," Elias replied, his tone gruff. "I'm not here to play mythmaker. What's going on here? What's left of the rebellion?" Kale stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of hope and wariness. "The Terran flame isn't a myth. It's real, and it's burning brighter than ever." Elias raised an eyebrow. "You really think a few miners and slaves can take on the Dynasty? You're dreaming." "Not dreaming," Kale said, awakening. Before Elias could respond, the distant whine of a Zerithian patrol ship echoed through the warehouse, the sound of death on the horizon. The rebels, or whatever they were, had been hiding here for a reason. Elias's hand instinctively went to his blaster, and Kel's expression hardened, the weight of the fight ahead settling in. "This is only the beginning," Kale said, his voice steady. "The flame has a lot more fuel than you think." The hum of the Zerithian patrol ship grew louder, signaling that the time for talk had ended. Elias's instincts kicked in. He grabbed Cal by the arm and pulled him toward a stack of rusted crates at the far side of the warehouse. They crouched low, watching through the cracks as the patrol ship touched down outside. Elias could see the distinct, towering figures of Zerithian soldiers emerging, their sleek, black armor reflecting the weak light from the station's artificial moons. "Stay quiet," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. "We don't want to fight right now." Kel's amber eyes glinted in the darkness, a silent understanding passing between them. He wasn't afraid, but he knew that Elias was right. The direct confrontation would be suicide. They needed to move, and fast. The last thing they wanted was to attract the attention of more Zerithian forces. As the soldiers dispersed and began scouring the area, Elias's mind raced. His thoughts didn't just focus on the immediate danger. They drifted to the larger picture. Kale had spoken of a growing fire, a rebellion led by a myth. But could this ragtag group really stand against the might of the Zerithian Empire? They had no ships, no weapons, and no experienced fighters. The odds were astronomical. But humanity, or what was left of it, had never been known for playing by the odds. The patrol seemed to move past them, their voices distorted by their alien tongues. Elias waited a beat longer than necessary before signaling to Kale. They emerged from their hiding spot and quickly made their way to a nearby maintenance tunnel, The only viable escape route. They would have to get off the moon, find the rebellion, and hope they could make something of it. They reached a nearby undercity market, the heart of the resistance on Oryx 9, where disenfranchised workers and refugees had begun to gather in secret. Elias had heard rumors of a handful of scattered rebels, human and alien, operating in the shadows. Kale led him down grimy alleys to a fortified warehouse. Unlike the abandoned one they'd just left, this place was alive with quiet activity. Figures moved purposefully between makeshift barricades, their faces hard and grim. "Welcome to the last flicker of light on Oryx 9, Kale muttered, pushing open the door. Inside, Elias was met with a scene of barely contained chaos. Alien technology mixed with scavenged human weapons, cobbled together in a way that could only be described as desperate ingenuity. A group of Makari war clones, tall and imposing with their battle-ready exoskeletons, worked alongside exiled nobility from alien factions, their faces drawn and tired, but determined. At the back of the room, a small holographic display of a galaxy spun lazily, showing strategic maps of the rebellion's progress. "We're scattered," Kale explained, lowering his voice. "But there's something here, something worth fighting for, if you're still interested." Elias scanned the room, his eyes sharp. There was no denying the desperation that clung to the faces around him. This was a fractured, scattered resistance. It was nothing like the professional armies he had once commanded, but there was an undeniable energy in the air, a feeling that these people were ready to rise, even if it meant dying for the chance. Elias turned to Kale, his face unreadable. "If we do this, we do it right. We can't just fight for scraps. We need ships, weapons, real firepower." Kale nodded. "That's why we're here. We have access to an old Xerithian weapons depot hidden on the outskirts, but we'll need more people, more resources. That's why I came looking for you." For the first time in a long while, Elias felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Hope. It was dangerous, reckless even, but it was a kind of hope that had been extinguished in him long ago. If there was even a chance that these people could rally together, if there was a chance to turn the tide, Elias would see it through. He straightened up, his posture shifting as he returned to the commander he once was. "Then let's make sure we do it right. This isn't about survival anymore. It's about taking back what's ours." Kale grinned, the spark of a shared goal in his eyes. "That's the spirit." Elias turned to the gathered rebels, his voice carrying through the room. "Listen up. We're not just some ragtag band of outcasts. We're the spark that will burn through the Empire. Get ready, because the fight for our future begins now." The underground base hummed with activity as the rebel forces made final preparations. Elias stood before a crude map of the Xerithian Empire, his eyes narrowing as he traced the glowing coordinates. His plan was simple but audacious. Take the Vestra Prime relay station, a critical communications hub used by the Xerithians to coordinate their fleets and keep the galaxy under their iron grip. "Vestra Prime is a key node in their entire infrastructure," Elias said, voice low but commanding. "If we hit them there, we cripple their communications and buy ourselves some time." Kale stood beside him, his eyes scanning the map with keen interest. "It's a heavily fortified station. We'll need a precise strike. No room for mistakes." Elias nodded. The plan was risky, but it was their best chance. The Xerithians had grown complacent, secure in their belief that no one could challenge them. That arrogance was their weakness. The rebel forces were a ragtag bunch, but they had learned to work together under Elias's leadership. The Makari war clones, once isolated and angry, now functioned as a brutal, well-oiled unit. The exiled Thraxian soldiers were fierce in combat, their reptilian instincts sharp and deadly. The human fighters, though inexperienced, had something no one else could match: resolve. The strategy was clear, a two-pronged assault. The first group, led by Elias and Kale, would infiltrate the relay station and disable its power systems. The second group would create a diversion, drawing the Zerithians' attention away from the main strike force. Night fell, and the time to act was upon them. The group gathered in the shadows of the base's loading bay, the faint hum of energy shields and the distant hiss of weaponry filling the air. Each rebel wore the same expression, a mix of determination and uncertainty. Some of them were just children, barely out of adolescence, while others were grizzled survivors of failed uprisings. But all of them shared the same fear, that this would be the last battle they ever fought. Elias clasped his blaster tightly. He felt the familiar weight in his hand, the tool of survival. For years, he had fought with his wits, but now, he would fight with everything. His skill, his rage, his will to see Earth's legacy survive. "Ready?" Cale asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Elias gave a grim nod. "Ready." They boarded the small fleet of ships, scrap vessels, stolen and modified for the mission ahead, and descended into the cold expanse of space. The sky above them seemed darker than usual, as though even the stars knew what was at stake. Approaching the Vestra Prime system, Elias's heart pounded in his chest. The station loomed ahead, massive and imposing, its sleek Zerithian design almost intimidating in its perfection. The assault would be swift, silent. They had only one chance to strike. The first phase of the plan went off without a hitch. A small group of rebels, led by the Makari war clones, infiltrated the outer perimeter of the station, planting explosives to disable the energy shields. Elias and Cale followed closely behind, keeping low and using the shadows to their advantage. Their ships skimmed the edges of the station's defenses, avoiding detection with a combination of stealth and sheer luck. As they reached the core of the station, Cal's eyes locked with Elias. "We're almost there. We just need to disable the primary reactor." Elias's mind raced. The reactor, hidden deep within the station's heart, was the key. If they could knock it offline, it would cripple the Zerithians' entire communications network. Without that, their fleet would be scattered, vulnerable. Suddenly, a shrill alarm pierced the silence, a red warning flashing across their screens. The Zerithians had detected them. "Damn it," Elias hissed. "We've been compromised." But there was no turning back now. The first phase had worked, but the second, the real fight, was just beginning. A flood of Zerithian soldiers appeared, materializing from hidden doors, their gleaming armor flashing under the dim lights of the station. Elias could see them clearly now, humanoid in shape, but with sharp alien features that screamed power and intimidation. Their leader, a Zerithian Shin, stood at the front, psionic energy crackling around him like a deadly storm. "You've made a grave mistake," the Chian growled, his voice like the rasp of 1,000 whispers. "You think you can bring down the Dynasty with such paltry forces?" Elias didn't flinch. He raised his blaster, aiming for the Pshin's head. "I don't need an army. I just need you to fall." The first shot rang out, cutting through the air. But the Pshin was faster, his psionic shields flaring up in defense. The explosion sent shockwaves through the station, but it was only the beginning of the chaos. Cale charged forward, his jewel blades drawn, leading the charge against the advancing Zerithians. Elias joined him, the two working in sync like a dance of death. Each blow was calculated, each step precise, but they were outnumbered. Just as things seemed bleak, a sudden explosion rocked the station. The rebels' diversionary force had launched their assault. The Zerithians were distracted, and Elias saw his opening. "Now," he shouted, and Cale nodded, the flames of battle lighting his eyes. With a final push, the reactor was disabled, and the station's power began to flicker. The communication relay went down, just as they had planned. The Zerithians had lost their grip. Elias stood over the battlefield, panting heavily, his eyes scanning the wreckage. This was just the beginning. But it was a start. The explosion had torn through the heart of Vestra Prime, and with it, the Zerithian communications hub had been silenced. The once unshakable confidence of the Empire's forces now teetered on the brink of collapse. The battle raged on, the sound of clashing weapons and explosions reverberating through the station's shattered walls. Elias stood at the edge of the chaos, his chest heaving as he surveyed the damage. His blaster was smoking, the barrel still warm from the last shot. Kale, covered in blood and grime, stood beside him, his breath ragged but determined. The Makari war clones and the Thraxian soldiers had done their part, fighting with the ferocity of cornered animals. The Zerithians, though powerful, had been thrown off balance, their psionic powers temporarily disrupted by the destruction of their communications grid. But this was far from over. "We did it," Kale muttered, his voice hoarse. "We took them down." Elias's lips twitched into a grim smile, but he knew better than to celebrate. "It's just a setback for them. They'll come for us, harder and faster now." His words proved true moments later when a new wave of Zerithian reinforcements appeared. The station shuddered with the arrival of Zerithian dropships, sleek and terrifying. The soldiers were different this time, more disciplined, more organized. Elias could sense the presence of their shins, the psychic warriors who commanded the Zerithian forces. They had come prepared to wipe out this small rebellion. "We need to move. Now," Elias ordered, pulling Kale toward a narrow corridor that led to the lower levels of the station. The rebels had planted explosives in key sections of the station's foundation, but the plan had always been to escape before the final detonation. It was a race against time now. Get to the evacuation point or be trapped in the flames of their success. The rebel forces had already started to retreat, taking casualties along the way. Elias and Kale fought their way through the lower levels, cutting down Zerithian soldiers with quick, deadly precision. The stench of burning metal and alien flesh filled the air as the sound of gunfire echoed around them. "There's a transport waiting for us," Kale shouted over the din of battle. "It's near the eastern docks." They reached the transport just as the Zerithian forces began to encircle them. Rebel ships, smaller than the enemy's but faster, were already launching into space, cutting through the atmosphere like streaks of light. Elias gave one last look at the battlefield, his heart heavy with the weight of their victory. They had crippled the Zerithians' communication network, but the Empire was vast, and retaliation was inevitable. "Get us out of here," Elias barked to the pilot as he jumped into the transport's cockpit. The ship's engines roared to life, lifting them from the surface of Vestra Prime. Kale joined him, glancing at the sensors. "They're coming after us." The transport shot toward the edge of the atmosphere, but a Zerithian fighter locked onto them, a red blip flashing on the screen. Elias cursed under his breath and pushed the throttle forward, taking the transport into a steep dive, hoping to lose the pursuing craft in the asteroid field surrounding the station. The transport shook violently as the fighter fired a series of shots, narrowly missing them. The stars outside blurred as Elias expertly maneuvered the ship through the narrow asteroid tunnels, the only defense against the pursuing Zerithians. "We've lost them," Kale shouted, relief washing over him. But Elias didn't share his relief. The victory on Vestra Prime was a blow to the Zerithian Empire, but it was a small one in the grand scheme of things. The Empire would retaliate, and they would retaliate with everything they had. The transport broke free from the asteroid field and entered the dark void of space. The rest of the rebel fleet awaited them, a handful of ships scattered across the galaxy, ready to regroup and prepare for the next phase of their war. Elias stood at the helm of the ship, his gaze fixed on the stars. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his decisions. The fight for humanity's future had only just begun. "We need more. We need to unite the scattered forces across the galaxy," Elias said, his voice steady, though a storm brewed in his chest. "And we need to hit them where it hurts." Kale, his hand resting on the console beside him, nodded. "The flame has been lit. It's time to watch it burn." The rebel fleet drifted in the cold silence of space, the stars an unblinking witness to the tenuous balance of their fragile victory. Elias stood at the bridge of their flagship, a battered old cruiser known as the Wraith, staring out into the void. The wreckage of Vestra Prime glinted faintly in the distance, a stark reminder of the price they'd paid for their small victory. The transport had successfully returned to the fleet, and though the mood among the rebels was mixed, exhausted and wary, they had accomplished what had once seemed impossible, a strike against the Zerithian Empire that had actually succeeded. But Elias knew that this was just the beginning. The Empire would retaliate, and they would come at them with a vengeance. The Terran flame was ignited, but it was far from certain whether it could spread. Kale entered the bridge, his battle-worn armor still covered in the dust and grime of the battle. His amber eyes gleamed with quiet resolve, but Elias could see the weariness in his posture. The fight had taken its toll on everyone, and there was little time for rest. "We've got a problem," Kale said, his voice low. "Scouts report that the Zerithians have already started mobilizing. Their reinforcements are on the move." Elias didn't flinch. "I knew it would happen. They won't let us get away with this. How long do we have before they strike back?" "Hours. Maybe less," Kale replied. "But we've got an advantage. They're scattered. This isn't just about holding off a retaliatory force. It's about taking the fight to them." Elias turned to face him, his eyes sharp. "What are you suggesting?" "We need to act quickly," Kale said, pulling up a holographic display on the bridge's main screen. The projection showed a scattered map of the galaxy, with key strategic locations marked in red. There are rebel cells spread throughout the galaxy, hidden, scattered, but still alive. If we can rally them, form a united front, we might be able to bring the fight to the Empire in ways they didn't anticipate. Elias studied the map, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the edge of the table. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. The risk was enormous. The Zerithians had their strongholds, their fleets, their shins, but the rebellion had something else. The element of surprise, the will to fight. "Do you really think we can unite them?" Elias asked, his voice low, measured. Kale's gaze hardened. "It's our only chance. We can't fight the Empire one small battle at a time. We need to build a coalition. We need to become a threat." Elias nodded slowly. It was risky, but it was the only way. If they stayed scattered, they would never be able to mount a serious challenge. They would be crushed, piece by piece. But if they could unite, if they could somehow build a federation of rebellion across the galaxy, the Zerithians would face a true insurgency. "All right," Elias said finally, his voice steady. "But we're going to need resources, ships, weapons, intel. We'll have to raid Zerithian outposts, hit their weak points, and use that as leverage. We need to show the galaxy that the Empire is no longer invincible." "We've got a few contacts in the Outer Rim," Kale said, glancing at the screen. "We can make a start there. And we'll need to take a more direct approach to the Shins," Elias continued, his mind already working through the implications. "They're the backbone of Zerithian command. If we can hit them where it hurts, we might just cripple their entire war machine." Cal's eyes gleamed. "You're thinking what I'm thinking, aren't you?" Elias nodded, a cold smile tugging at his lips. "We need to find a way to take out the Shin Lords. And we need to do it fast." The room fell silent as the weight of the new plan settled over the rebels. Taking on the Shins, the most powerful of the Zerithian elite, was a dangerous gambit. Their psionic abilities were beyond anything humanity had faced, and every encounter with them had ended in destruction. But Elias was no stranger to impossible odds. He had led humanity to war against a much stronger enemy before, and he would do it again. "We're in uncharted territory now," Elias said, his voice echoing through the quiet room. "But we don't have the luxury of waiting. We strike while we can." The words hung in the air as the rebel commanders gathered their forces. They would split into smaller factions and take on high-value Zerithian targets across the galaxy. The Pshidans were the key, and Elias was determined to find their weak points, whatever it took. As the rebellion's new campaign began to take shape, Elias knew the stakes had never been higher. They were no longer the hunted. They were becoming the hunters. But in the shadow of the Zerithian Empire, would their efforts be enough to ignite the fire that could burn the dynasty to the ground? The galaxy was a fractured mess of alliances, betrayals, and scattered resistance movements. Elias knew that if they were to stand a chance against the Zerithian Empire, they would need more than just raw force. They needed information, precision, and allies, each one more essential than the last. And for that, they would have to enter the heart of enemy territory. The plan was simple, almost reckless. Infiltrate a Zerithian Pshin stronghold, learn their secrets, and eliminate their leaders. The Pshins were the architects of the Empire's brutal campaigns, gifted with terrifying psionic powers that allowed them to bend minds, manipulate entire populations, and crush resistance with ease. If Elias and his forces could destroy or disable their control over the Empire, they might stand a fighting chance. Kale stood beside him on the bridge of the Wraith, looking at the holographic projection of their target, a heavily fortified Pshin citadel located on the capital world of Jareth, the crown jewel of the Empire. Its towering spires and immense military defenses made it seem invulnerable. "We're walking straight into the lion's den," Kale said, his tone grim but resolute. "I hope we're ready for this." Elias's gaze never wavered from the screen. "We don't have a choice. The longer we wait, the more Jareth will tighten its grip. If we hit them here, we force the Empire to shift its focus. And we take down their most dangerous weapon." The Pshin Citadel was home to the Pshin Lords, a council of the Empire's most powerful psychic leaders. They were revered as gods, their minds capable of controlling entire fleets with just a thought. To go after them was suicide. At least, that's what everyone else had believed. But Elias had a plan, one that hinged on surprise, stealth, and the element of chaos. The rebel fleet was split into smaller groups, each tasked with distracting the Citadel's outer defenses. Kale and a hand-picked squad of elite fighters would infiltrate the heart of the Citadel, planting explosives in key areas that could collapse the entire structure. Meanwhile, Elias would take on a more subtle role, intercepting Zerithian communications and gathering any intel on the Pshin Lord's vulnerabilities. "Are we sure this is the best approach?" Kale asked, skepticism creeping into his voice. "We're not exactly a stealth army." Elias smirked, the edge of his old commander's confidence returning. "We're not going to sneak in, Kale. We're going to infiltrate. We strike fast, hit them where it hurts, and leave before they can mobilize their forces. The Pshins won't know what hit them." The transport vessels carrying the rebel assault teams launched from the fleet, slipping through the darkness of space toward the planetary atmosphere. On board, Elias's heart thudded in his chest. They were about to cross a line they couldn't uncross. Failure meant death, plain and simple. But success could change everything. The Citadel loomed ahead, its jagged silhouette cutting into the sky as the transports descended through the thick clouds. Zerithian fighters rose to meet them, but the rebel ships were agile, darting through the air with reckless abandon. They drew the defenders' attention away from the central landing zone, where the primary assault team would land. Elias was on the ground first, his boots hitting the alien soil with a dull thud. He could feel the pulse of the Citadel beneath his feet, the Pshian's influence seeping through the very ground itself. It was like a storm waiting to unleash, a quiet hum of malevolent energy. The plan had one flaw. The Citadel was surrounded by a dense psionic field, a mental barrier designed to keep out intruders and distort any communications. Elias had prepared for this, though. In his pack was a neural dampener, a device capable of scrambling the Pshin's psychic fields just long enough to get through. "Everyone stay low," Elias muttered as he activated the device. A low hum resonated through the air, and for a brief moment, the psionic pulse around them flickered. It was just enough. They sprinted toward the Citadel's outer walls, blending into the shadows. Kel's team was already inside, causing distractions and sabotaging security systems. The Pshin Citadel, though massive and intimidating, had one glaring weakness: its arrogance. It was the seat of the Empire's power, and the Gerithians believed themselves untouchable. That belief, however, was about to be shattered. Elias's team infiltrated deeper, past the outer layers of defenses, until they reached a central command room. The walls were adorned with strange alien symbols, and at the center of the room stood a massive holographic display, showing the movements of Gerithian fleets across the galaxy. Elias's fingers flew across the control panel, pulling up information on the Pshin Lords. There, in encrypted files, was a hidden vulnerability. A Pshin Lord named Malka, the cruelest and most powerful of them all, was vulnerable to a rare electromagnetic frequency. The frequency could disable his psionic abilities, rendering him powerless. Elias smiled grimly. This was the break they needed. "Kale," he said into his communicator, "we've got what we need. We take out Malka. We take down the Empire's spearhead." The clock was ticking. But with this intel, Elias knew one thing for sure. The rebellion had just found its weapon against the Gerithian Empire. The Pshin Citadel was a sprawling fortress of alien design, its towering spires stretching toward the heavens like fingers of a cruel god. The heart of the Empire's power lay in the Pshin Lords, and Elias had just learned the one thing that could tear their reign apart: a weakness, a crack in the seemingly unbreakable armor of the Gerithian Empire. With the frequency that could neutralize Pshin Lord Malka in hand, Elias knew they had to act quickly. The longer they lingered, the more the Gerithians would tighten their grip on the Citadel. He relayed the information to Kel, who was already deep in the Citadel's lower levels, preparing to execute the second phase of the plan. "We've got our opening," Elias said, voice low but urgent. "Take out Malka, and we take out the brain of the Empire." Cal's reply came through the comms, his voice laced with determination. "Understood. We'll move quickly. The Pshin Lords won't know what hit them." The plan was set. Cal's team would strike first, using the distraction they'd caused to cut through the Citadel's defenses and reach Malka's inner sanctum. Meanwhile, Elias and his squad would provide cover, ensuring that the path remained clear for Cal's strike. They all knew that failure meant the end, not just for them, but for the entire rebellion. This wasn't just a raid. This was a decapitation. As the seconds ticked by, Elias's mind raced. The Gerithian Empire had been invincible for centuries, but now, for the first time, they were vulnerable. They had hit them where it hurt, undermining the foundation of their power. The Pshins, the very source of the Empire's strength, were on the brink of collapse. But they still had an ace to play: Malka himself. "Ready?" Cal's voice crackled in Elias's earpiece. Elias glanced around the darkened room of the Citadel's central command, his team poised for action. "Let's do this." A deep tremor ran through the Citadel's structure as the battle began. Explosions echoed from the lower levels, followed by the sound of weapons fire and the faint hum of psionic energy as the Pshin Lord's defenders mobilized. The rebellion's forces fought fiercely, but they were always a step behind the Gerithians' psionic commands. They were outgunned, but their will was stronger. Elias and his team moved fast, cutting through corridors and disarming security systems as they went. The plan was simple: get to Malka, neutralize him, and get out before the entire Citadel turned on them. Every corner was a potential death trap, every hallway a battleground. The Pshins were not to be underestimated. If they sensed their vulnerability, they would retaliate with everything they had. They reached the inner sanctum, where Malka's presence pulsed in the air like an oppressive storm. The door opened with a hiss, revealing the Pshin Lord himself. Tall, imposing, with eyes that shimmered with dark power. His mind was a swirling vortex of psionic energy, a being of terrifying ability. "You're too late," Malka intoned, his voice reverberating with otherworldly power. "You cannot defeat me. I control the very fabric of this empire." Elias felt the pressure of his psionic aura immediately, heavy, crushing. It was all he could do to keep his composure, to not give in to the oppressive force that Malka exerted on his mind. But he held steady. "We don't need to defeat you," Elias said, his voice unwavering. "We just need to neutralize you." He gestured to the small device in his hand, the frequency generator, and activated it with a swift motion. A sharp, high-pitched sound filled the room, causing the walls to reverberate. Malka's eyes flashed with shock, but before he could react, his psionic powers began to falter, his mind unraveling in an instant. The Psionic Lord staggered, his control over the Citadel's defense systems slipping away. His once godlike grip on reality shattered like glass. Kale and his team stormed into the room, weapons raised, but Elias held up a hand, signaling them to stand down. Malka was incapacitated, but the danger wasn't over yet. There was still one more part to play. "We've done it," Elias said, panting, his mind racing. "Malka's down, but we need to get out of here. Now." They wasted no time. The explosives planted throughout the Citadel were on a short fuse, and the clock was ticking. As they retreated down the winding corridors, the Citadel began to shake, the structure buckling under the strain of the destruction. Elias had expected the Zerithians to retaliate, but what he hadn't expected was the sheer ferocity of their response. A Psian's voice boomed over the intercom, a final warning. "This is not over, human. You will pay for this." But Elias didn't stop. He couldn't. The rebellion had dealt the Empire a devastating blow. And now, the galaxy would feel the repercussions. As they emerged from the Citadel, the Wraith was waiting in the sky, ready to take them back to the fleet. The rebellion had struck its first decisive blow, but there was still so much more to do. The Zerithian Empire was vast, its hold on the galaxy unyielding, but the Terran flame had begun to burn brighter than ever. Elias looked to the stars above, the future stretching out before him. The war was far from over, but the rebellion had found its purpose. And for the first time in years, Elias felt a sense of hope. They had just taken the first step in the long road to freedom. The galaxy was watching, and the Terran rebellion was ready.